Auron, should we start by talking about 2020 and why it was a pivotal moment for you in terms of understanding politics? So not just COVID, but also the riots of the summer. What was the sort of combination of factors that you thought were politically explosive in theory terms?
Sure. Like a lot of people, I think I had this very common conservative American understanding of how the government was supposed to work. We had the Constitution, we had the Bill of Rights, we had the separation of powers. Very proud of this document and the way that it's supposed to restrict the power of the government. And so I always believe that when tyranny came, obviously, we had to be vigilant, we had to work to maintain our freedoms, but ultimately government could not usurp all of these rights because we had these freedoms, we had these protections. And I had been working as a political reporter in 2016, the lead up to the Trump election and then his presidency. And I had seen the way that the story was shaped by a lot of what happens in the press gaggles, the way that reporters often lie or manipulate things, and the way they treated Trump had me worried that maybe some of the things I thought were going to be safeguards weren't really working. And then obviously when we saw what happened in 2020, it was just a complete shattering of my preconceived notions of the way the government was supposed to work. All of the churches were closed, but we were having liquor stores and strip clubs were open. You weren't allowed to go see your ailing grandparents or attend a funeral, but you had these massive race riots where people were burning down buildings, and we got lies from scientists about how actually this was stopping the spread of COVID when this is clearly not the case. And so it was just really the way that each one of these institutions that we had entrusted power to and thought that we're going to provide this neutral form of governance that was going to protect our rights, the way that each one of them fell, and the way that each one of these narratives that I had believed in about kind of popular sovereignty and the restrictions on government fell apart, and the way that all these people who had been preaching them to me, these conservatives and libertarians around me who had been scared about big government and the encroachment on our freedoms their whole lives, just went along with all of it and just had some excuse as to why they needed to go ahead and do so. And that's ultimately why I ended up writing the book that I did, because I needed to better understand why we ended up.
It was treated, I guess, by a lot of these conservatives and libertarians who maybe were uncomfortable with lockdowns and so on, but they were able to sort of fold it into a historical narrative where this was a brief blip, this was just an aberration, and we would return to service as normal, as soon as this particular crisis was over. That's not your view, though, right?
Absolutely. The thing that really got me, the reason that I quickly snapped into reality, was the fact that all these people seemed to act like this was just going to go away, like things would go to normal, that this wasn't a big deal. It's a momentary suspension, but obviously we'll go right back to this. And as the weeks dragged into months and 2 weeks to stop the spread became, well, maybe we just do this until we get vaccinations. We never know when vaccinations will come. Oh, we have vaccinations, but we're going to keep doing the lockdowns, and maybe you need a second or a third vaccination. It became really clear that actually we were just going to be governing in this permanent state of exception. And as I went back and I looked at history and I looked at some of the political theory that I was exploring, I realized that actually, while the pandemic was the most obvious form of this had been going on for a very long time. This was a slow process. The frog had been boiling for quite a long time, and it was really only the fact that this was so compressed into one particular moment that we realized what had been happening. And so the fact that even this incredible exercise of power by the government didn't snap people out of what has been going on for a very long time started to worry me. And that's why I felt it was necessary to kind of put a case together as to why this is not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a very long process that we've been under in the West.
I also found 2020 to be a very instructive year politically. I think for me, I used to have much more faith in the government. Like, as a conservative, in a kind of paternalistic way, that's kind of where I was at in, say, 2019. But I used to have a lot more faith in the benevolence of the government. And believing that there are certain functions that the government ought to perform, even though the government has not, I mean, as you lay out, has not historically performed these functions. Our governments are so much larger and more powerful and more intrusive than any that have existed, really. I mean, talk about that. So we should start. What is the Steelman, the kind of mainstream position on this? Not just the progressive account or the leftist account, but the mainstream conservative accounts of where we've come from and where we've got to in terms of political structure.
Well, I think for most people, they look at, and this is, of course, a big part of the American story, but I think it's become a wider part of the way that the West understands its relationship with liberal democracy. They look at government in the past and they see these stories of monarchs, kings, these kind of things, and they think of those as evil dictators who had this ability to snap their fingers and command anything at a moment's notice, this God emperor mentality that they had this infinite amount of power. And all of this was wrapped up, of course, in the church and religion and superstition, this backward way of organizing our societies. And then somewhere in the 1600s, we got the scientific method and we got the revolution in thinking, the Enlightenment that brought us to this point where we could apply a much more rational understanding of the way we should organize our societies, political science, sociology. We discovered that we could create systems, and these systems would govern us in a very neutral way. We would go ahead and put our trust, our power into these carefully constructed systems with written constitutions and institutions that are staffed with experts and are able to go ahead and make these politically neutral decisions about the way that we should be acting. And it's a very comforting thought because it makes us feel like, A, we're not governed by irrational individuals, but by a cold, calculating, mechanical understanding of the way that the world works. And so therefore, we're not subject to the whims of some crazy tyrant, but ultimately, we're always being governed by the most logical and scientific application of social policy. However, what we found, I think, looking at what happened during COVID, is actually those systems aren't neutral, that they have their own agendas, that they have their own incentive structures, that ultimately we're not ruled by some cold impersonal system, but we're ruled by a specific class of people who have their best interests and their power and their aggrandizement at the forefront. And they're willing to manipulate and in some cases even burn down some of the credibility contained inside those institutions in order to go ahead and increase their own power. And so I think that's been the rude awakening for a lot of people who thought that popular sovereignty, ruled by the people, the voice of the people, was going to limit this power of government. But what we have understood is actually by handing over that understanding to institutions and believing that we were no longer ruled, we actually enabled the growth of government to a level that would have been unimaginable by the most powerful tyrants of the past.
It's very easy for people who are maybe new to this to hear these kind of analyses and think this sounds really cranky, this sounds really conspiratorial, right? But it doesn't actually rest on conspiracy, or at least not on sort of macro conspiracy. Obviously, in practice, people do conspire with their political allies. That's to some extent what politics is, right? But this doesn't actually depend on some sort of any Illuminati type structure, right? This happens much more organically than that. I mean, so you borrow Curtis Yarvin's idea of the cathedral, right? Could you explain just briefly what that idea consists of?
Absolutely. It's very strange the way that we've managed to have conspiracy branded, right? We know conspiracies are, of course, real. People conspire, they organize. That's a normal thing. But we've attached it to this wild-eyed understanding of conspiracy theories where some crazy guy in a shack, has a bunch of yarn, tying different newspaper articles together. And that's what we think of. But the truth is that, like you say, ultimately, we have people with similar interests, and those people will work together for their own betterment. And that doesn't mean that there's some kind of cabal, some kind of Illuminati sitting at the center of world government and typing out, coordination papers in the way that, we're going to tell each one of the world leaders to run, though with the WEF, that's not entirely incorrect. Well, really, what Curtis Yarvin, the insight that he brings to this scenario, is the understanding that ultimately what we have is a distributed, decentralized, atheistic theocracy at work. We have a collection of people who all share the same class interests. They all share the same moral worldview of progressive liberal humanism. And because they all share that base understanding of morality and that base understanding of the way that institutions and society should be structured, they all tend to work in the same direction. Even though they have their own individual agendas and their own disagreements, you can see the way that different parts of the ruling class are pushing back against each other. The college protests we have in America right now between the pro-Israel and pro-Palestine sides of the left show us that obviously these two factions are not always in sync. But generally, what is happening in our Western institutions is that everyone goes to a university and they have to get credentialed in that university to become part of the ruling class. And when they go to that university, they spend 4 to 8 years steeped in this shared ideas of progressive secular humanism. And ultimately, everything they do, from the status they achieve to their ability to date somebody, their ability to do well inside of their classes, is all based on their performing correctly and speaking in the language of progressive secular humanism. And if we were in the Middle Ages and everyone was speaking as if they automatically understood Christianity, they were swapping Bible verses, they were structuring their marriages and their business deals, and they were all showing up to the same building on Sunday, we wouldn't say there's a conspiracy there. We would just say that they're all Christians. And ultimately, that's what the cathedral model is trying to show, that we didn't get rid of religion. We just replaced it with a secular version, one that allows our ruling class to speak the same language and share the same ideology and the same values and move in a similar direction and coordinate together, even if there's no explicit organ of coordination, no Politburo, no Joseph Goebbels sitting at the top and handing down the specific propaganda that every institution should be disseminating.
And in fact, not having someone like Goebbels sitting atop all of this makes it more durable because it's more spontaneous, it's more diffuse. Everyone is doing this based on their own self-interest, not because they're being commanded to do so by one single point of authority. And I think also crucially, people don't know that they're doing this. People within well, I mean, some people do, but in general, people within the ruling class, and indeed the rung below the ruling class. I think, if anything, the rung below the ruling class are almost more important, right? Because they are, because they aspire to be part of the ruling class. They're particularly eager to emulate this vision, to repeat these mantras, to do all the right things. You know, if you, I don't know, if you want to get a job at Goldman Sachs or at McKinsey or at any other well-paid professional role in some enormous corporation, you simply cannot say be openly homophobic. You simply cannot. Like that will destroy, and everyone knows this. And so everyone spontaneously acts in this manner because it's readily imbibed from the culture, and it so obviously is in your interests to behave accordingly. So yes, there's no conspiracy. It's more, I guess, it's culture, but it's a mode of power nonetheless.
Yeah, we look at someone like Brandon Ike of Mozilla, the Firefox, and obviously this is somebody who is a very powerful individual. He's not a climber. He's not somebody who's desperate to make it in, and yet because he donated to Proposition 8 in California, the proposition that was looking to ban gay marriage in that state. I know that sounds wild, that's something that actually passed at that time. It's not that long ago, but that shows you how influential elite opinion is. But the fact that that was discovered meant that he had to be removed from his own company. That's the power of this ideology, is even those at the very top end up being subject to it. And so we can really see that I don't think people think a lot about the idea of competing axioms anymore. They don't think about the idea of existential claims opposing each other anymore. We got rid of this idea when it came with the Enlightenment. We thought that we had kind of gotten rid of all the existential questions, and really the marketplace of ideas was going to mediate all of these questions. But ultimately, the reason that we find ourselves having a hard time putting our finger on what is exactly ruling us is it's an entire memeplex. It's an entire, almost, I wouldn't say organic, but it's an entire a network of ideas, ideologies, beliefs, moral views that are in contrast and significantly challenge many of the things that a lot of people in the West thought that they believed in. But we don't know how to approach that because we kind of got rid of the tool set, the very ancient tool set of how to recognize an opposing worldview that is completely incompatible with your own. And so when we look at this, we hope to find some kind of rational answer, some way to go ahead and mediate the conflict. But what we find ourselves in is really a situation where the system we have is unable to deal with this clash of ideas.
So talk through the link between this kind of atheistic theology that's at the heart of power and the total state. What is the link between the two?
Well, ultimately, every society has to have, like we say, a governing moral vision. They have to have a shared idea that they should be investing in, directing the way they are going to go. We like to think of these neutral institutions. They don't take sides. They don't have a moral viewpoint. But ultimately, that's a lie. Again, as we saw with the pandemic, that's just not the case. And what happened is that throughout our history in the modern era, we have placed a lot of our classic duties as individuals in a culture, in a society, into the hands of the state. We've given up different duties like the ability to raise our children, educate our children, care for the elderly, protect ourselves. These are all things that naturally fell to smaller social spheres: the church, the family, the tribe, the community organization, the labor union. These were all things that bound people together in voluntary and involuntary associations. And each one of these commanded certain duties from us, certain loyalties from us. And the state required those things to exist because it could not handle all of those functions. And that meant that the power of the state was naturally checked by the inability of it to consume all of those different aspects of society. But slowly what has happened is we have built up this capacity through large bureaucratic institutions. The Industrial Revolution, the massive power of scale, has allowed us to go ahead and shift many of those responsibilities into the total state. And that feels liberating, right? That's how we end up with these massive governments, but people still think they're freer than any time in history. That should be those two things should be opposition, right? As the government grows, we should feel that we're restricted, but instead, because we've been handing over these personal responsibilities that used to be owed to these different social spheres, these competing social spheres, to the state, we feel liberated. But what's actually happening is that over time, the competing social spheres that actually check the power of government, not words on paper, not constitutional guarantees, but the actual loyalties to different parts of communities that kept the state from completely consuming this, ended up going away. The kind of liberal idea of the neutral institution allowed us to place so much of what we used to think of as sacred things that we had a duty to perform into the state. And as that occurred, the state consumed all of that power to this point, or to the point now where most people can't even imagine raising and educating their own children without some kind of constant intervention by the state. They can't imagine the idea that they would be responsible for their own physical safety, or that they would care for their neighbor or for the elderly, or that the church itself would handle all of the charity involved in a community. All those ideas are now beyond us. And what it's created is this learned helplessness where the individual in this liberated society really has no other way to have any kind of social architecture, nothing else to fall back on except for the state. And that's why the state now feels like it has the ability to reach into every interaction. It has the ability to mediate every part of our lives, because ultimately we've handed over those individual duties to these large bureaucratic institutions.
This episode is brought to you by Cozy Earth, the source for all of your bedding, bath, and loungewear needs. Cozy Earth sell all sorts of products: duvets, temperature-regulated sheets, towels, men's and women's clothes of all kinds, PJs, knitwear, socks, sweatshirts, super high quality, really luxurious, fantastic source of wedding gifts. My husband has one of their bamboo quarter-zip sweatshirts, described as ultra soft. It really is ultra soft. He's one of the fussiest people I've ever come across when it comes to finding clothes uncomfortable and itchy, and he absolutely loves this sweatshirt. MMM listeners can get a special discount of 40% if you go to cozyearth.com/Maiden or use the code COZYMMM. That's COZYMMM. Again, 40% off. That's a really good discount. And please, if you're asked in the post-purchase survey, do let them know that you heard about Cozy Earth from this podcast. Transform your home into a sanctuary with Cozy Earth. And in doing so, we do tend to become very dependent on them psychologically and also for basic things. You might know that, I swear this is relevant, Britain has the lowest breastfeeding rate in the world in terms of the proportion of babies that are still being breastfed at like 6 weeks after birth. And a popular narrative as to why this is because the state, i.e. the NHS, the National Health Service, doesn't provide enough breastfeeding support and instruction to new mothers. And I always think about this, like, do you really think that your feudal lord was providing breastfeeding classes, right? Like in a period when it was 100% breastfeeding, right? I mean, obviously that's partly because formula didn't exist and a lot of time babies just died, like a lot of bad outcomes, right? But that's not the crucial factor here. Like the crucial factor, I mean, I think the crucial factor is one, the availability of formula, which just makes it easier. To some extent, corporations having pushed formula in order to make money onto new mums, and also the fact that the extended family has frayed and the community is frayed, and so women having access to informal instruction from other women in their families and their networks has gone. And so the expectation is, well, if the state doesn't perform that function, it simply won't be performed. And to some extent that's true, because when the state encroaches on these areas, the previous provision of these services does wither away. It's like a very it's a very predictable process.
Absolutely. And so I think this is why we've seen the steady growth of government and the comfort with which people will hand over their information, hand over their duties, hand over their liberty, what in the more classical sense, because they feel like ultimately they no longer have the ability to act without an expert. And this is also why our governments have become so unaccountable, because ultimately even the people that we elect don't feel like they're really in charge, especially in the United States. I think a lot of people were shocked to find out during the pandemic that while Donald Trump was president, he was not in charge of the country, that Anthony Fauci was in charge of the country, that the global health organizations, the WHO, were dictating policy, the Gates Foundation, all these unelected massive organizations, these experts were the ones that were really in charge. And I think, again, that was a comforting thought at first when we thought that meant that it saved us from, the caprice of any one ruler. But what we found is actually there's just as much danger in these decentralized systems, these bureaucratic systems, because ultimately that means that no one is held accountable. And they've sucked so much power in that no one knows how to operate without them. They think they have to check an expert at every moment when they want to take any kind of action. But ultimately, there's no one to hold accountable for the decisions that are made.
Peter Turchin, the academic, who is much less, explicitly radical than you or than Curtis Yarvin, is much more sort of sober academic. But he's written just, empirically, straightforwardly, America is a plutocracy. I'm sure that Britain is also a plutocracy, in the sense that whenever there is some difference of opinion between the economic elites and not just the poor, but the middle classes as well. Whenever there's any policy, I mean, sometimes the preferences of the middle and working classes will be the same as those of the economic elites. But whenever they're not, whenever there's a difference, in 100% of cases, it's the economic elites who get their way. So just on that basis, it's just clearly not the case that America is a democracy in a meaningful sense. It's just a fact. It's not a conspiracy. It's just a fact that it's actually governed by a relatively small number of powerful people under the guise of popular democracy.
Well, and I think ultimately this is the problem that has been, that we have had, because the idea that mass democracy would check the power of government, it just doesn't bear out anywhere in history. This is not some weird glitch in the system. This is what happens in democracies. Ultimately, the incentive is always for the ruling class to stay in power. The thing that we lied to ourselves is that we got rid of ruling classes, but that's just not true. There is always an organized elite, and they always lead. I'm not trying to say that to discourage anyone. I'm not even saying that it's immoral. I'm just saying that it's true, in the same way that gravity is real. And so ultimately, there will always be people in charge. And what every ruling class needs is a political formula, a narrative that legitimates their rule. And what we decided in the West is that ultimately that should be based on popular sovereignty. Well, the ruling class is not going to just give up their power because a bunch of people get together and pull a lever somewhere. That would be really stupid, and just that's not going to happen. So what the requirement for mass democracy did, the requirement of that legitimization did, was require the ruling elites to create a mass organization, a mass institutional advantage to manipulate the opinions of the public. So like you said, oftentimes the interests of the lower middle classes will be separate from the upper classes. And maybe if they had control of the operation, the people would go ahead and choose something else. But ultimately, it's the ability of the elites to go ahead and wield the power of especially the press, but also academia, the unelected parts of the executive branch in the United States, which many people call the deep state, and many other organizations like large corporations, censorship through social media, to control information and change the way that things work. And oftentimes, even when we do get very straightforward votes that signal the desire of the voters, the slow manipulation of procedural outcomes through what we call the democratic process means that actually those things never get implemented. And so ultimately, for instance, again, in the United States, we saw that things like gay marriage and transgenderism were not popular just 20 years ago. There were many votes. The public opinion was against them. Everything about democracy says that we shouldn't have gotten the kind of developments we've gotten. And instead, we've raced from, oh, two people should be able to get married, to, no, you need to give puberty blockers to 8-year-olds in just inside a little bit over a decade. And clearly that's not because those things are popular, and it's not because it's what voters wanted. It's exactly the opposite of what they wanted. But it's what elite opinion manufactured, and therefore it's what became law, all under what we said was supposed to be a democratic process.
COVID would be another example of this, right? Where I think to some extent support for lockdowns was a consequence of manufactured consent, that people were frightened by the media. And one of the effects of lockdown was people not, I should say, like, I think that lockdown would have been a reasonable response to a more serious disease. My main complaint against lockdown at the time, and still, was that COVID didn't justify it. It was tyrannical. It was too tyrannical, given the actual threat. And also, to be honest, if the disease had been more dangerous, it wouldn't really have been necessary to ask people to lock down. They would have done it spontaneously, because they would have, like, say it had a different age profile and it affected children with the same severity that it affected the elderly, people would have just spontaneously stayed home. Schools would have spontaneously emptied. You wouldn't have actually needed that degree of state intervention. The reason we needed that degree of state intervention to affect lockdowns was because people were not scared enough, and then they were scared by the media and so on. But anyway, one example, though, of a case where actually there isn't even manufactured consent, there's just straightforward popular dissatisfaction, is mass immigration. And that's really radicalized me, in the sense that I see, in Britain, many other countries, it just keeps happening. It just keeps happening. It just keeps, if anything, numbers grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And the government occasionally makes noises about reducing some kinds of immigration, but they just don't. And polling is so clear on this, and always has been. And it happens anyway. And that's when I really get to the point where I'm like, in what sense is this a democracy? That's when I really get my tinfoil hat out. I don't know how you can look at an issue like that and conclude that we live in a democracy.
Yeah, immigration was definitely one that blew my mind when I started looking into it, especially when I saw the immigration crisis in Europe and the way that was impacting different countries. I started to look then at the American system and what opinion had been. And if you look at the American system, you look at the way that poll numbers have come back consistently. Even Democrats, even left wing people were very against illegal immigration, and in many cases, just all immigration for my entire life. Until just recently, it was very, very unpopular in all polling from all sides. And yet, even the Republicans, were making the argument for open borders. Bernie Sanders, big leftist, used to say that open borders was a Koch brothers conspiracy, a right-wing conspiracy to bring down the wages of workers in the United States. And by the way, he's right about that. Or he was, but now he's changed his tune because he wanted to be in power. He wanted to run for president. He wanted to be able to fundraise. And so he knew he had to get on board with this idea, this elite opinion that open borders were healthy and good for the United States. And so, yeah, that's, again, just a perfect example of the way that ultimately that decision is never going to be made with the people's good in mind, because really the whole point is to manipulate or alter or always shuffle the deck, and you can continue to keep the idea that you have a legitimization due to popular sovereignty there to keep the people kind of in line. But ultimately, you know that the real thing you need to do is manipulate opinion and manipulate procedure to make sure that they're focused on one thing or another long enough to go ahead and get you into office the next time around, so that you can return to pursuing your actual agenda.
Again, to refer to Peter Turchin, partly because I've just read his book End Time, so it's fresh in my mind, but he writes about the period of, the Gilded Age in America, period of mass immigration from Europe, particularly from places like Ireland and Italy to the East Coast. He argues that it was just straightforwardly a consequence of westward expansion. So you had poor people in crowded East Coast cities moving west because they could, and because they wanted more land, and because they wanted to have a higher quality of life, meaning that you had a shortage of cheap labor in those cities, and business interests didn't like that. And so the political solution to that was to bring in cheap labor from Europe. This is not just a story unique to our times. This is a story throughout modernity, what's a little bit mysterious, I suppose, although I think I know the answer, is it's clearly in the interest of business, a big business, to have mass migration of cheap labour. Clearly. Why is it, though, that the kind of rung below that, people who are not actually directly profiting from mass immigration, people who, in fact, I'm thinking of some of my peers who live in London and who can't get on the property ladder because housing is so expensive, and who are seeing their quality of life deteriorating before their eyes, and yet will nevertheless continue to insist that open borders is a moral imperative. Why do they think that? Because they're not directly profiting from that. Is it just because they're sort of aspiring to be members of the ruling elites who do? Is it kind of a top-down ideological transfer, do you think?
Yeah, when Gaetano Mosca coined the phrase political formula, one of the things he thought was really important for people to understand is that ultimately it's not just the noble lie. It's not just Plato's idea of creating the lie that legitimates the rule, but it's something that actually both the ruling class and the ruled must really believe in. It's not enough simply to have kind of this cheap facade. I mean, that'll work for a while. You can rule on straight power for a little bit, but ultimately that's a fragile way to rule. It's brittle. It will break. And so there has to be buy-in at every level of the system that the people in charge are in charge for a reason and deserve to be there. And so that means that the ideologies, whether we think they seem suicidal or not, have to be bought into by a good percentage of the populace. And especially, as you point out, those who are aspiring to power. The strivers are always the truly dedicated, right? The ones that are desperately trying to reach into the ruling class are always the most fervent enforcers of the ideology. And in really most Western countries, the ideology that's been pushed is that you deserve to be replaced. that it's wrong to prefer your nation, your people, your traditions, your way of life, that the other is always right, that it's always good to take them in and replace that which was part of your country with something outside of it. And while that does seem like a path to suicide for pretty much any people, it is the way that I think a lot of people truly feel at this point in pretty much every interaction, that ultimately, the movement of having no children, of giving away all of your property and not passing it down to the next generation, of abandoning your faith and, coming out proudly to talk about how you've sterilized yourself, about how you're going to make sure that, no one else ever shares the evil ideas that your parents or grandparents had. I mean, these are all parts of the same ideology of basically self-annihilation. And it's all done in order to show and signal that ultimately you could be one of the ruling class. You could be one of the people who should be in charge because you hold the correct views. And the correct views at the moment are that the West really doesn't deserve to exist.
Where's this come from, though? I mean, it's clearly disseminated in the media. It's not hard to find, high status media outlets espousing this as a high status view. But it surely hasn't come from, there must have been fertile soil to some extent, fertile psychological soil in this stratum of the class hierarchy. The factors that occur to me, the ideological factors, de-Christianization, the shock of the Second World War. What do you think? What do you think is going on? Why were people so easily persuaded, apparently, on this apparently suicidal ideology?
Oswald Spengler said that every civilization has a metaphysical animating spirit attached to the religion, but not just the religion itself. And that drives it through its morphological cycle, right? It's born and it grows and it blooms, but ultimately it also dies. And he believed that once a society reached what he called the civilizational phase, which is one in which all of the animating spirit, the metaphysical spirit, had been kind of trapped inside institutions and organizations instead of being allowed to act freely and in this true animating way, that ultimately what every civilization does is create its own version of the mirror image, the anti animating spirit, its own version of atheism, basically. And he said that this is what every civilization does, is it kind of deconstructs itself. It no longer finds a reason to live. And I think ultimately that's where we're at. I think that the West has reached a point where it has abstracted its identity and its spirituality so far out and has rationalized and turned it into this cold, distant thing, to the point where ultimately all it wants to do is deconstruct those things. And so that's really where the game has been for the last 70 to 80 years, has been the desire to deconstruct everything about our identity. You look at what's happened and kind of the radical left, the progressivism really is it doesn't have it doesn't make sense on paper. A lot of the pieces there shouldn't be working together. They shouldn't agree. But the one thing they're all kind of there to do is disassemble Christendom. And so we've watched as all of our creativity, all of our everything that makes a culture what it is, has been centered on this kind of ritual of breaking down and sucking the bone marrow out of what's left of the Christian skeleton of the West. And we're getting to the point where I think that fountain itself is running dry, and that's why we can all feel like culture is stagnating and there's no passion in these things anymore, is because ultimately it's almost a death drive to go ahead and disassemble that which made us what we were when we were a prosperous and growing people.
So this is an inevitable consequence of this stage of the civilizational cycle, that you don't think there was any way of avoiding it? It was always going to happen?
I think that, of course, there are decision points, right? There are places, of course, where there are revivals, there are renewals, that things are restored and reborn in different ways. But I do think that this was always a crucible that we were going to face. And ultimately, these things always shift what a civilization is. I mean, of course, we can look at the classic reference point, which is, ancient Rome. Ancient Rome goes from being a kingdom to a republic to an empire. Part of the empire dies, but it continues on in the Eastern kingdom. And in each sense of the term, they were Romans. They were the Romans, but they were fundamentally different people at those different points as well. And so I think there's a civilizational continuity if we make different choices that will allow us to carry parts of our tradition and our identity forward. But I do think that unfortunately you always face these crucibles because of the nature of civilizations. And I think that does explain a lot of why we ended up in the scenario we're in right now.
Is the total state an inevitable part of that? Because it seems to me, but maybe I'm wrong, that the degree of totalizing that our state has achieved is historically unprecedented, perhaps because we have more sophisticated technology than people of the past did? Or do you think that actually does tend to be a feature of the winter of civilizations?
I think all civilizations do go through this cycle. Again, to Gaetano Mosca said that all civilizations move from feudal to bureaucratic, and that they move between these two states. And so I think that a very natural pattern. I opened the book with a passage from the Bible about the Tower of Babel because I think ultimately we are reenacting that archetype that there is a metaphysic to power that draws it to centralize, and that creates the dynamic that we're currently experiencing. However, I think you're correct that the intensity of our current pattern is tied to the fact that we are modern people with technology that allows a level of complicated social interactions and massification that simply did not exist previously. The amount of connectivity we have through mass communications, the internet, the ability to build these massive structures that undergird our economy and our social organization also allow for a level of total control that simply was never available to anyone else. It's not that previous, tyrants would not have availed themselves of the kind of technology or the kind of power that we have now. It's simply that they did not have the option. And so, yeah, I do think that, especially again, the managerial state and the focus on systematizing every human interaction, dehumanizing the individual so that they fit more cleanly into the managerial structure and therefore can expand the efficiency of the system. I think that is particular to our current social structure and has allowed for a level of totalitarian control that didn't exist previously. But I do think that the process is still one that plays itself out across history again and again.
Yeah, our state has the means to inspect private conversations. There was a recent case in Britain where some retired police officers, so they weren't even employees of the police anymore, had a WhatsApp group and they were swapping like boomer memes because they're all in like 50s and 60s. And one of their memes was like mildly to moderately racist, and they ended up being dragged before court for this because the WhatsApp chat was made of, it was, police are one of those categories in Britain of people who don't have the right to keep their private conversations on their phones private. They can be seized at any moment by the state, and you can be convicted of, any hate crime you care to name. And like that degree of intrusion into people's private, non-official conversations is amazing. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure that plenty of tyrants of the past would have loved to have that capacity, but they just didn't because the technology didn't exist to enable it. I mean, it's worth saying, I suppose, that the total state, it does offer people things as well, right? Like there's a kind of pact where, yes, you have this degree of intrusion and control, and any sense of gained freedom is completely illusory. But you do also get, would you say, more comfort, more safety? I mean, what's the trade-off? Why do people not just take to the streets and violently resist this kind of imposition? The episode is not over, there is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road, allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.